please welcome our first guest of the day, the brilliant Minh Hua, Chief Talent Officer over at Stanley Black & Decker. Good morning to you, Minh.
Good morning. Great energy, and thank you for having me.
Absolute pleasure. Lovely to have you back with us. Looking forward to the talk this morning. Minh, the last time we spoke, I think it was probably about a year ago, 18 months ago or something, you were talking to us about something you called the attrition supercycle, which feels very much like it might be the great resignation. So you've obviously got form for spotting trends a way out. What are you going to be talking to us about today?
Today, I'm going to talk about behavioral economics, what it is exactly and what it's not, and how it relates to HR. I'm hoping your audience will walk away with a mental toolkit in which to hopefully do their job better.
Yeah, great stuff. That sounds like a good point for me to hand over to you. So we'll get your slides up here. Folks, as ever, over the last couple of days, please get your questions over to us. We'll put those to Minh. We'll bring you up yourself so you can ask those questions. I'll be back to facilitate that process later on in the session, Minh. But for now, over to you.
Ben, thank you so much, and great energy. And big thanks to you and your production crew, Brianna. A really well done event you have here. So for the audience, I'm going to try to go through a lot of material really quickly because I want to reserve enough time for your questions. So feel free to put your questions in the chat box and we'll take care of them at the end. Okay. So today is about behavioral economics. Let me slice that up a bit. So there are two types of behavioral economics that most relates to HR. Choice architecture is about designing the context in which humans make decisions. Behavioral architecture is about supporting behaviors that people have chosen to take. I've defined that very intentionally, okay? There's lots of discussion about the ethics of choice architecture, and rightfully so. As you all contemplate the ethics of this as an independent thinker, please be cognizant of an inconvenient fact. A neutral state architecture does not exist. So what does that mean? We do not live in a world without things that lead us to think one way or another. A neutral state architecture does not exist. We are constantly bombarded by bits of data and influences of the past. In fact, our brains each day deal with 34 gigabytes of data. That's more than your smartphone and your laptop can hold, but our brains have to deal with it each day. The world in which we live in already has biases, nudges, and architecture of the past. We're just used to it. So super important for me to emphasize, to not engage in choice architecture is to leave ourselves tied to the way it has always been. Sometimes that's good, sometimes that's not. So the key here is ethics. Now, here's a simple example of behavior architecture. We're going to get more complex as we go throughout this presentation, but I wanted to start with this very simple org chart. This is the org chart I use for my team. How is it different than the org charts you're accustomed to see? The design feature here, very intentional, includes no reporting lines, no titles. The one that I actually use has names. And then I am deliberately placed near the bottom. And then near the top, you might notice we have a team dog. This chart says what it aims to do, bust hierarchy. This is an example of behavioral architecture. It's not scary, and it doesn't have to be overly complex or elaborate. If anyone listening out there works at Microsoft, Workday, or Facebook, I would like to advocate for an org chart alternative like this in the software that you sell to companies. I think it's a very important behavior architecture. So just a mundane example there. So how do we do this? We begin with values, we dive into data, we find empathy, and then we design. So the process that I'll submit to you all is begin with values, dive into data, find empathy, and then design. Try not to start with designing. Most people rush right to the design. When I've seen teams do that, they fall in love with their plans, and confirmation bias makes it incredibly difficult to ask first principle questions or fully appreciate contradictory data points. So let's start with values. So starting with values is not soft, weak, or hokey. Somehow, since the 1970s, we developed an implicit belief that it's better to separate social issues from the workplace. I think this shift was due to the shrinking role of the church in society and large-scale social changes that occurred in the 50s and 60s. It was just a lot of change and perceived to be too disruptive if let into the workplace. Now, that all started to change about 10 years ago. What happened in the past decade? Changing demographics, social media, the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, LGBTQ rights, Stop Asian Hate, the pandemic. We're in the midst of another change in fundamentally how we think about this. If this group is anything like the broad population in the United States, many of you are not in agreement with one or two of the changes that's just happening, and that's okay. It's not about picking a side, it's about having that conversation in a safe place. So as you think about values, this is one of the best books on ethics I've actually ever read. It gives you a little bit of history, but it's very, very pragmatic. So just to be clear, what the main thrust of this book is essentially, we spend too much time thinking about right versus wrong. I know that's a startling thing to say. We default to right versus wrong, which means I'm right and you're wrong. And just to be clear, there is right and wrong in this world, but those aren't the issues that you and I face on a daily basis. The author talks about analyzing right versus right, which is the hard work of ethics. So as HR leaders, we face issues such as quarterly targets versus layoffs, loyalty, short-term versus long-term thinking, individual versus group, conservative versus liberal, to vaccinate, not to vaccinate. The hard ethical decisions are not about right versus wrong, it's about right versus right. So I highly recommend this book, and we'll peel back the ethics layers throughout this. So here's the first case study. It's about career mobility. It's a true story. A large tech company had an internal transfer policy that stated all employees could transfer to another team at any time, including on their first day at the company. Managers at this company were up in arms. I believe in supporting career paths, but this is ridiculous, said one manager to me. We are putting the business at risk. The HR business partners was perplexed as well. Wouldn't it be better to ask employees to stay in their job at least 1 year? So that was the case. And in that year, it was probably the most controversial issue that didn't make the news. So we started by exploring our values. What are they? We want to support career paths. People shouldn't be in roles they do not like. Business continuity is important. So you see how it's about right versus right and not right versus wrong. And you see how we go from a situation, the case on the left, to our values. And we're not going to start with designing. And we're not going to start with data either. It's the situation. So we just talked about values. Now we're going to dive into data a little bit. I'll start with a question for all of you in the audience. How data-driven are you? Please type it in your chat box. Characterize it however you want. How data-driven are you? And we will go through this case study as we go along. Let me give you all a second. How data-driven are you? Good. So I think getting some good responses here. Good, highly data-driven. I think all of you are data-driven. And so if you can't do math, or you're afraid of statistics, or you don't base any of your thoughts on facts, you're still data-driven. Data is often misunderstood to mean numbers and binary facts. That's just one type of data. Quant, opinion, experience are all data, and they all matter. Rarely is the answer found in just one type of data, and we're going to see that through these case studies. Now, you would think data scientists, PhDs, are the most data-driven. From my experience, not really. With data scientists, I find myself amazed with the lack of data outside of numbers. I would challenge data scientists I work with, and I've worked with many of them over several companies, and I'll challenge them with this question. Yes, this is statistically significant, but is it clinically relevant? Okay, startling thought, but data scientists aren't always that data driven. With HR folks, I tend to have the opposite challenge. And my response kind of runs along the line of, I acknowledge how you feel, and let me play it back to you so I make sure I've heard you. Now tell me about other types of data. At a town hall, I saw this one successful guy in the bottom left corner of the slide here, who's great with numbers. He said over and over, when the numbers and experience disagrees, the experience is usually right. My point on this slide is all of you are data driven. You just might need a little more diversity in your data. So don't be afraid of data. So back to the case study. Here's one of my LinkedIn surveys. I asked my network, how much time should someone spend in a job before they are eligible for an internal transfer? So I wanted a different type of data, right? What this tells me is that the super majority of people believe there should be some minimum time period before an employee can transfer to another job. Nearly half thinks it should be 12 to 18 months. And I think all of you will have an opinion. My job is not to agree or disagree. My job is to listen to what they're saying and what you're saying, and what you're not saying as well. What most managers and HR business partners did not like about an internal transfer policy that let people theoretically transfer on day one was that it would be highly disruptive to the business. It just didn't feel right. It didn't feel fair. I needed to honor that concern, so I looked for a more diverse set of data. So when we measured behavior, we found that less than 0.0025 of employees transferred within a year. Remember, there wasn't controversy on waiting 2 years or even 18 months, really. It was about less than a year, and especially about less than 6 months. But less than 0.25% of our employees actually transferred out of their jobs within a year of starting it. That factoid was surprising to everyone. Managers and HR VPs alike thought an internal transfer policy that let people move around whenever they wanted was going to destroy the business. It was now clear that the benefits of the policy far outweigh the costs. The benefits found in retention, branding, culture. And then the controversy stopped. A secondary lesson of this case study is that the most controversial employee policy that year was resolved with about 27 minutes of data work. Don't be afraid of the quant data. It's not always hard. So this is one of my favorite books about data. It makes teaching data and statistics accessible because it's about a topic we can all relate to: dating and romantic relationships. Christian Rudder, really smart guy, was the co-founder and data scientist for OkCupid. He's no longer there. Again, great book. I've read it like 3 times. He says, and I love this quote, instead of asking people survey questions or contriving small-scale experiments, I could go back and look at what actually happens. The data was sitting right there. That has been my experience. The data is just sitting right there for you to look at it. He's also right about observing behavior being far superior, the far superior form of data. That's kind of what Jeff Bezos said in the previous slide. I do think what I do disagree with Christian on is that I do think there is a role for opinion polls. You can find in voice data insights that you can't find in behavioral data. So again, diversity of data. In this book, he dispels many myths about how people choose their romantic partners and who to date. We're not going to get into that in this session, but it's a great book that just happens to teach you statistics and about data at the same time. So we started with values. We just saw how data can clarify disagreements. Now let's look at another case study: how we take vacation, something we can all relate to. The studies, some medical, some performance related, show that health and wellness can be optimized with a vacation stretch or duration of 8 days, 8 contiguous days. In addition, research of soldiers in the Iraq War showed that it took about 4 days for the cortisol levels to get to a pre-stress state. Okay, net, triangulating the data, vacation durations should be at least 4 to 8 days long. Longer if you can, but minimum 4 to 8. Go shorter, the health and wellness impact is very minimal. According to Qualtrics, now diversity of data, we're going to walk through it. According to Qualtrics, which is a survey company, 24% of people say they typically work 3 hours or more each day while on vacation. A quarter of your knowledge workers work 3 hours or more each day while on vacation. That's startling to me. 49% said they work at least 1 hour per day. Only a quarter of people use all their vacation days in any given year. This is the moment Europeans roll their eyes at Americans, by the way. The motivation when asked was basically fear of falling behind was the top reason people work during their vacation. There are a lot of questions to unpack here. Health and well-being, company culture, retention. 51% said more vacation time would encourage them to stay at their current company. So let's think about retention for a moment. 51% of your workforce will be more likely to stay if they had more vacation days. The easy answer is to increase vacation benefit. But a quarter of your employees are not using what you've already given them. And when they are, about half of them are working during vacation. So yeah, you could increase your vacation allotment. No, I have no issues with that. It may cost your company more, and so you want to think about that as an HR executive. But you could also optimize how vacation is being used. What if you design a choice architecture to help people choose to unplug during vacations, and a behavioral architecture to help people do what they would like to do, and that's unplug? In behavioral economics, we find over and over again that good intentions don't lead to intended behavior. It's a design flaw in many HR programs. We think this is important, they'll recognize this, surely they'll do this. But over and over again, that does not happen. So what are some ideas on that behavioral architecture, that choice architecture? Role modeling, reverse the social pressure, get your CIO to develop a big red button that pauses emails and instant messages when someone's on vacation. Lots of things we can do here. But what exactly the design depends on your company values, the data that you see for your specific company, and empathy. So let's talk about empathy a little bit. This is Sean, by the way, who's head of our people analytics at Stanley Black & Decker. In this section, I want to activate your heart and the non-analytical side of your brain. So we started with values. We just talked about data. Now we're going to go into empathy. And I'm going to do this by not talking, no words. I'm going to show you 4 photographs, and I just want you to look at it. So if you're multitasking and you're trying to just hear me to follow, this is the part of the presentation which I'm not going to talk. So I just want you to look at the photographs. No words. Ready? 3, 2, 1. Thank you for staying with me there. The font and color of this page is deliberate behavior architecture. I want you to look for the empathy because it's not always apparent. So, and this is Khalifa, who hired on my team about a year ago as our director of behavior architecture. She's now our vice president for employee voice and recognition. So we started with values, we dove into some data, we were looking for empathy. And now let's talk about design. How do we do this? So let's do, this is our last case study. You want to provide your employees with a mobile-first experience. One option is to provide a portal to your company's intranet through a proprietary app. The building of the app is the easy task. Believe me, HR teams and always think about the building of the app. That is by far the easiest part of it. The critical success factor is whether employees will download the app and use it routinely. You are competing against millions of other apps, many of which are consumer grade and backed by millions of dollars worth of behavioral architecture. What do you do? So we start with our values. Privacy is important. We think a mobile experience will reduce barriers between employee and information. And we want routine voluntary behavior. Here's a framework that I really like. It's created by Stephen Winded. And the acronym is CREATE. It's how to analyze how your employees or your audience will receive what you're trying to do. So in our HR app example, John Doe or Jane Doe, well, let's say Min. So something in my mind or environment needs to trigger the notion in my mind that I want to use this app. Okay, that's the cue. Most HR designs over-index on emails and timelines as the primary cue. Low efficacy, terrible. Because it's not really a cue, it's like a cue you have to remember, which isn't really a very effective cue. Okay, so something in my environment or in my mind has to trigger that notion that I want to use this app. Reaction. My mind will react to the cue in milliseconds and decide consciously or not whether to devote energy to the action. We are a glucose preserving creature. And this happens typically in milliseconds. Evaluation, I might briefly think about whether I want to do this. Do I want to access this app that HR just rolled out to me? Ability, factors such as the location of my phone, when that cue happens, the amount of battery power I have left, my Wi-Fi signal, if someone's with me, that all contributes to the ability or inability to take action. Timing, your mind thinks about and your heart feels whether this is the right time to do it. I remember, oh gosh, you know what? My chief people officer want me to look at this app. Do I feel like doing this right now? Most HR designs ignore this. And then finally, I'm influenced by the experience I've had the first time with this app and then with other things totally unrelated to the app. Okay? So what I want to impress upon you right now is a framework in which when you're thinking about choice architecture and behavior architecture, that you and your team should spend thoughtful time with. Walk through these steps the next time you try to roll out a program and you want to shape their behavior. So we've walked through the process: values, data, empathy, and design. We could spend weeks on design alone, but I think I'm running out of time. So I hope this crash course is helpful to you. I'm happy to take questions now or even after today. My contact is provided here. Ben, let's go to questions.
Yeah, great stuff. Fascinating insights, Min. Many thanks for sharing. So, folks, please do get your questions over to us, and we'll get you up here so you can ask Min directly. Some fascinating stuff to dig into. Just a quick question from me, Min, while I'm waiting for the coffee to kick in for our audience here. You talk about this idea of breaking existing paradigms, breaking the wheel, breaking the cycle, etc. What's been the hardest part of implementing this approach over at Stanley Black & Decker? Oh, Min, I may have just lost your audio there. Have you just accidentally hit mute?
There we go.
There we go.
So I won't speak of any specific company, but I will speak of my experience. So the most difficult part from get the HR team. I'll talk about the end user and then the HR team because this is our audience. The most difficult part about the HR team is the HR team typically doesn't analyze programs this way. So go through that create framework. We tend to think if I build it, they'll come. And we tend to rely on hierarchical-based motivation, which isn't that effective. From the biggest challenge from an end user perspective is attention span. You know, how do we get the cue to trigger the attention and get them to want to do it and get them to want to expend the energy towards that behavior?
Yeah, and is that about nudge theory? We've heard a lot about nudge. Is that how is this different to what to the behavioral architectures that you're talking about?
Yeah, I try to avoid nudge theory because it's gotten so diluted, right? It means different things to different people, like it's a magical potion. It's a buzzword right now. What I would instead say is go through cues that create framework. Nudges, there are some studies actually that says nudges don't work as well. And in the early studies in which the nudge theory is based on, some of the underlying data has not been replicated successfully. So I'm still a fan of nudges. I think it works under the right conditions, but don't spend energy there. Go to the create framework and think through what you're trying to do.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Min. I guess this kind of ties into this idea about good intentions not always having intended behaviours as a result. How are you kind of breaking that particular cycle and actually ensuring that the good intentions are realised in terms of the behaviours that you want people to see, the outcomes that you want to achieve?
Yeah, you said it right, Ralph. Good intentions don't move behavior. It's about that choice architecture and that behavior architecture, right? It's going with empathy and saying, okay, how would I get Ben to spend time on this HR app when he's busy, he's at home, he'd rather spend time with his family. It's thinking through that. Good question, Ben.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Ben. We've got a question from the audience, so let's go now to Matt over at Space Force. Hi there, Matt.
Thank you for taking the call. Great presentation. Thank you for that. I think there was a point within your data analytics that you talked about. An anecdote potentially outweighs the data.
Yes.
I don't disagree that there are times that makes sense, but historically I've seen if a leader sees it successful at one time, it's nearly impossible for them to translate or change their mindset for that next time when the data does outweigh the anecdote, specifically when there is clinical proof. So have you confronted that before, and how did you address that with some of your with your interactions?
Yeah, no, great question, and thank you for speaking up. Yeah, so what statistics and numbers are great at is revealing things that happen at scale that we might just get a thin sliver and come up with a wrong interpretation, right? So data is great for that. However, as my doctor told me a few months ago when they were looking at some test results, he said, "Min, this is statistically significant, but it's not clinically relevant." And so we need both, because I will posit, and I know this could be startling for those who are very data driven. Numbers can mislead you as often as anecdotes, and it's a problem. And if we think quant data is the only way to go, there's a name for that, and it's called a religion. And we should not be overly focused on one type of data. We need that diversity of data. And so I think the principle that we could carry is, seek data that disproves our beliefs, and that'll carry us far. Hopefully I've answered your question.
You did. If I had one follow-up, I think your the quant data is very relevant, but in what we do in human resources, it's most qual data. I mean, that's where we live most of our life is qualitative data. So when you start speaking of data analysts focused on what the numbers say, and it's a scope, it's a time and place in history that's definitely confined to that moment. I recognize that. What I've found throughout my experience is that somebody is always going to believe that their gut, no matter if there's predictable reliability or practical reliability from the data, qual or quant data, is going to continuously lead us down a path that may make changing the tide or changing that behavior and choice architecture nearly impossible. So I appreciate it. I thank you for your time.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. And we'll see that. And that's why different people respond to different data. That's why the diversity data. And if someone just doesn't react to quant data, then provide experiential data or polling data. There is some data that that human will react to. You just got to find which one. Great. But we see that all the time. Thank you.
Yeah, great stuff. Thanks for the question, Matt. I think we've got another question next up from Stephanie. Hi there, Stephanie. Good to see you this morning.
Hi, how are you guys today? Nice to see you. So I think my question is really, it might be self-evident, but when we talk about values first, a lot of companies have values on a wall that say this is what our values are as an organization. But I think there's a lot of unstated, culturally reinforced values within the organization as well. And I feel like that first step needs to dig in beyond the values on the wall to what really are the values organizationally that might be unstated.
You are absolutely right. And that's in choice architecture. That's why I want us to start with values and state it, because there are so many unsaid assumptions about the values that it may vary. And what the human brain tends to do when you're analyzing this is that you forget. And what I mean by forget, it's transitional forgetfulness. So if I ask you, Stephanie, what's the first principal value here? You can probably state it, but somewhere along the line, if you didn't document it and you weren't explicit about it, in your design, you veer away from it. So transitional forgetfulness. You can intellectually recite it back to me, but you forget. So that's why I want us to start with values. Thank you, Stephanie. Great question.
Yeah,
Thanks.
great stuff. Thanks, Stephanie. Lovely to see you this morning. Amin, that is all we've got time for today. But many thanks for sharing your thoughts here this morning. We'll be sure to get people to reach out to you should they have any further follow-ups post the session.
Sounds good. Thank you, Ben. Appreciate it.
Lovely stuff. Great speaking with you again. You take care.